Harlem, 1936. The corner of 131st and Lenox smells like rain that hasn't fallen yet. A cigarette burns low in a stranger's hand. Somewhere behind a barbershop window, a radio hums a tune nobody's really listening to. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson doesn't walk through Harlem. Harlem arranges itself around him. Doors open a half-second early. Voices drop a half-octave. Even the pigeons on the tenement ledges seem to know when to stay still. Tonight, none of that matters. Tonight, a man named Curtis Ray has just done something no one in Harlem has done in 11 years. He raised his hand to Bumpy Johnson's daughter. Not a threat, not a warning shot. A slap, open palm, across the face, in front of a card table full of witnesses who will spend the rest of their lives wishing they'd been somewhere else that night. 10 minutes later, Curtis Ray is folded into the trunk of a black Cadillac, and the only sound in the world is the hum of tires against wet asphalt, carrying him toward a conversation he will not survive telling anyone about, because the man asking the questions does not raise his voice. He does not need to. This is not a story about violence. Violence is easy. Any fool with a temper can throw a punch. This is a story about what happens when a man forgets the one rule that keeps Harlem's peace. Some debts get collected in dollars. Others get collected in time you didn't know you had left. By 1936, Bumpy Johnson's name carried weight the way certain church bells carry sound. You didn't need to see it ring to know it had. He'd clawed his way up from Charleston, South Carolina, through Harlem's numbers rackets, through prison stretches that would have broken lesser men, until his word became as good as law on streets the actual law had long since abandoned. He didn't run Harlem alone. Nobody runs a place like Harlem alone. But when disputes needed settling, when a debt collector got too rough with a grandmother behind on her rent, when a beat cop got a little too comfortable with his fists, Bumpy's name got mentioned in rooms where mentioning it was the same as filing a complaint nobody could ignore. He kept two lives running parallel, like train tracks that were never supposed to touch. One life belonged to the streets, numbers, protection, respect collected the hard way. The other belonged to a brownstone on West 138th, where a wife pressed his shirts, and a daughter grew up believing, for as long as he could manage it, that her father was simply a businessman who worked long hours. Her name was Odessa. 19 years old, sharp-tongued, sharper mind. She worked afternoons at a record shop on 125th, not because the family needed the money, but because Bumpy believed idle hands built idle character, and he had not survived this long by raising a daughter who mistook comfort for safety. She knew pieces of who her father was, not everything. Enough to understand that certain names weren't said too loudly in certain company, and that certain men crossed the street rather than pass too close to their front stoop. What she did not know, what she could not have known, was that keeping her clean of his world had made her, in the eyes of men who resented her father, the softest target Harlem had to offer. Curtis Ray was not a big man in Harlem's underworld. He ran small errands for smaller men, collected debts nobody important cared about, and nursed a grievance that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with pride. 3 years earlier, Bumpy had humiliated Curtis's older brother in front of a room full of men, publicly stripped him of a numbers route for skimming, sent him back to Georgia with nothing but bus fare and a bruised reputation. Curtis never forgot. Men like Curtis rarely do. They carry humiliation the way other men carry cash, folded tight, kept close, spent eventually on something they'll regret. He'd watched Odessa for weeks, not with romantic intention, with calculation. He'd learned her schedule, the record shop, the walk home along Lenox Avenue where the streetlights ran thin between corners. told himself this was strategy. It was cowardice wearing strategy's clothes. On a Thursday evening thick with early spring humidity, Curtis approached her outside the shop, offered a cigarette she didn't want, said her father's name with a sneer he didn't bother hiding. When she told him to leave her alone, he grabbed her wrist. When she pulled free and called him something considerably less polite than his name, he slapped her, hard enough to split her lip, hard enough for 3 witnesses on the sidewalk to freeze mid-step, hard enough that word reached West 138th Street before Odessa herself did. Some mistakes take years to understand. This one would take exactly 10 minutes. The news reached Bumpy through Isaiah, the quiet man who had watched Harlem's corners for him longer than either cared to count. Isaiah didn't run. Running drew eyes. He walked into the brownstone at a pace that looked ordinary to anyone watching from the street, and only Lillian, standing near the stove, saw the tightness around his mouth that meant something had gone wrong. Bumpy was in the study, a ledger open in front of him, a pen resting between 2 fingers. Isaiah didn't knock twice. He never needed to. Odessa's hurt. The pen stopped moving. That was all. No dramatic rise from the chair. No shout that shattered the quiet of the house. Just stillness. The particular stillness of a man deciding, in the space of 2 seconds, exactly how the next hour of his life would unfold. Where is she now? Home? Your wife's with her. Who? Isaiah said the name. Curtis Ray. He watched it land on Bumpy's face and disappear, just as quickly, absorbed into something colder underneath. George's brother. Yes. Bumpy closed the ledger. He did not close it hard. A man who slams doors is a man still discovering the size of his own anger. Bumpy had long since finished discovering his. Where is he? Card game. Basement on 132nd. He doesn't know we know yet. Bumpy stood, straightened his cuffs, a gesture so ordinary it might have belonged to a man preparing for church, not for what came next. Then let's not keep him waiting on an explanation he already owes. They found Curtis exactly where Isaiah said he'd be, in a smoke-heavy basement room, 3 tables of cards and dice, the kind of place where men came to lose money they didn't have in the company of men who didn't care. Curtis sat with his back to the door, a stack of chips in front of him, thinner than his confidence. The room noticed Bumpy before Curtis did. That was how it always worked. Conversations died mid-sentence. A dealer's hand froze over the deck. Somewhere near the back, a chair scraped as a man decided he suddenly needed air. Curtis turned last of anyone in the room, and when he saw who was standing in the doorway, his face went through 3 separate expressions in under 2 seconds. Confusion, recognition, and finally, the particular gray pallor of a man realizing the bill has arrived and he cannot pay it. "Mr. Johnson, I—" "Don't." Bumpy's voice did not rise. It never needed to. "You don't get to open your mouth yet. You already used it once tonight to say something you shouldn't have." Curtis stood too fast, chair scraping back, chips scattering off the table edge. It wasn't like that. "She came at me. My daughter's lip is split." Bumpy took 1 step into the room. Just 1. "You want to finish that sentence? Or you want to think a little harder about the next thing you say?" The other men at the table had gone very still, the particular stillness of men trying to become furniture. Nobody reached for a weapon. Nobody needed to ask what this was about. Word traveled through basements faster than through newspapers. Curtis's hand trembled near his jacket pocket, not reaching for anything, just trembling, the body's own confession running ahead of the mouth's excuses. "I wasn't thinking. I'd had a few drinks. You knew whose daughter she was." Bumpy's tone remained level, almost conversational, which made it worse than shouting could have. That's the part that interests me, not the drink, not the temper. You knew exactly whose door that walk led back to, and you put your hand on her anyway. I didn't mean to hurt her bad, I swear. You didn't mean to get caught. Bumpy studied him the way a tailor studies a poorly cut suit, not with anger, with disappointment at the waste of good material. There's a difference, and you know it, and I know it, and every man in this room watching us right now knows it too. Isaiah moved without being told, positioning himself near the room's second exit, not threatening, just present, the way a locked door is present. Curtis's eyes darted toward it and found no comfort there. Please. The word came out smaller than Curtis intended. Whatever you want, money. I'll pay whatever. This isn't about money. Bumpy's eyes never left him. You didn't put your hand on my ledger, Curtis. You put it on my child. Those don't settle the same way. The silence that followed lasted 3 full seconds, long enough for Curtis to understand, with the particular clarity that arrives only when it's too late to matter, that there was no version of tonight where explaining himself out of this room existed. Bumpy tilted his head toward the door. Walk. Where? You'll know when we get there. Curtis looked once around the room, at the frozen card players, the dealer still holding a suspended deck, the exit Isaiah now blocked, and understood there was no room left to negotiate inside. He walked. Not because Bumpy pushed him, because in Harlem, in 1936, some men understood that fighting the current only meant drowning tired. Outside, the Cadillac idled at the curb, engine humming low beneath the streetlight. The trunk was already open. The drive north out of Harlem took 11 minutes. Curtis counted every one of them from inside the trunk, in the dark, with nothing but the growl of the engine and the rhythm of turns to tell him where he might be headed. Fear does strange arithmetic in the dark. 11 minutes became an hour in his mind. An hour became a lifetime. When the car finally stopped, the silence afterward was worse than the noise had been. The trunk opened onto a gravel lot behind an auto shop that did legitimate business by daylight and quieter business after. No neighbors close enough to hear anything. No streetlights close enough to see anything. Just Bumpy, Isaiah, and a man who had made the costliest mistake of his life over a slap that took less than 2 seconds to throw. Curtis climbed out shaking, hands raised without being told to raise them. Mr. Johnson, please, I got a mother. You had a brother too. Bumpy's voice remained even. George's still living, because I decided a public humiliation taught a better lesson than a private one. I'm starting to think I was wrong about that. I'll leave, tonight. I'll leave Harlem. You'll never. You'll leave when I decide you leave. Bumpy circled him slowly, the way a man inspects a car he's already decided not to buy. Right now, you don't get to make plans. Right now, you get to listen. Curtis went quiet. In Harlem, men learned quickly that when Bumpy Johnson stopped raising questions and started delivering statements, survival depended entirely on how well you listened to what came next. You put your hand on a 19-year-old girl walking home from work. Bumpy stopped in front of him. Not a rival, not a man who wronged you, a girl whose only offense was carrying a name you resented. That tells me something about the kind of man you are when nobody bigger than you is watching. I was drunk. I wasn't thinking straight. Then you'll have plenty of time sober to think about it. Bumpy nodded once toward Isaiah, who produced a folded set of papers from his jacket, not a weapon, something Curtis hadn't expected at all. You're going to work off what you did. Not to me, to her. Every week, money goes to the family of the record shop owner, whose window you frightened customers away from. Every week, for as long as I decide is long enough. Curtis blinked, confusion cutting briefly through the fear. That's it? That's the beginning of it. Bumpy's expression did not soften. You so much as walk down the same block as my daughter again, and this conversation will look like mercy compared to the next one. You understand me? Yes, sir, I understand. Say her name. Curtis hesitated. Say it. Odessa. You'll remember that name every week when you're short on rent and still finding money to pay this debt. That's the point. Not to break your bones tonight. To make sure you carry this mistake with you longer than any bruise would have lasted. Isaiah closed the trunk. Curtis stood in the gravel lot, alive, unbeaten, and somehow more shaken than if the outcome had been violent. A bruise heals in weeks. A debt like this one would follow him for years. A permanent reminder stitched into every payday, every glance over his shoulder, every night he lay awake wondering if tonight was the night patience ran out. Word moved through Harlem the way it always did, not through headlines, but through barbershops, stoops, and card tables, where men who'd witnessed nothing still somehow knew everything by morning. Curtis Ray had raised his hand to Bumpy Johnson's daughter. 10 minutes later, he was in a trunk. By sunrise, the story had already hardened into legend, the kind repeated in half-whispers to newcomers who needed to understand, quickly, how Harlem's unwritten rules actually worked. Nobody saw a body, nobody heard a gunshot, and that, more than any violence could have, became the lesson men actually remembered. Bumpy Johnson didn't need to kill a man to make Harlem understand where the line sat. He needed only to demonstrate, once, decisively, that the line existed, and that crossing it cost more than most men had the stomach to pay. For weeks afterward, Odessa noticed something different in how strangers looked at her on the street. Not fear, exactly, but a kind of careful respect, the recognition reserved for someone standing closer to real consequence than most people ever stood. She hadn't asked for that recognition. She hadn't wanted the reason behind it. But it was hers now, inherited the way certain names in certain neighborhoods always come with weight attached. Bumpy never spoke of that night again. Not to her, not to Lillian, not to anyone who hadn't already been standing in that basement or that gravel lot. Some lessons, once taught, didn't need repeating. They simply needed to be understood, completely, permanently, by everyone who'd been close enough to watch. This wasn't a story about a man defending his pride. It was a story about a father drawing a line that Harlem had quietly understood for years, but rarely needed tested. That some things could not be bought, negotiated, or apologized away, no matter how much a man begged in a basement full of witnesses. Curtis Ray learned that lesson the hard way. In 11 minutes, he'd remember for the rest of his life. And Harlem learned it too, not through violence broadcast for spectacle, but through the quiet, absolute certainty that some fathers don't raise their voices when their children are hurt. They simply make sure the debt gets paid.